Hello and welcome. Welcome to Jeremy and to Megan. Jeremy, we're so pleased to have you with us today on this new webinar series, which is called In Conversation With. So I'm looking forward to a conversation with you. For our viewers, welcome to you. And I'd just like to bring Megan in. She's joining us all the way from New Zealand, and she will be putting your questions to us. Megan.
Yes, we're very much looking forward to your questions. Could you use the Q&A button at the base of your screen? You can direct your question to either Jeremy or Felicity. And please, would really appreciate it if you keep them brief so that we can get through as many as possible.
Thanks, Megan. And we'll be seeing you later then. Thanks so much. For viewers who don't know Jeremy, although I can hardly imagine there's anyone who doesn't know Jeremy Lent, Jeremy is the founder of the Lilology Institute, which is an institute which brings together it integrates science systems with the ancient wisdom traditions. And he's putting forward these ideas as a way of perhaps helping us into the future we all want. I'll just say a word about myself too, and then we'll go on telling you something more about Jeremy's work and also about the work of Share International. I'm Felicity Eliot. I'm based in Amsterdam at present. I'm the editor of Share International magazine, which was founded and started by Benjamin Creme. Now, for viewers who don't know our work, Benjamin Creme worked for 40 years to bring certain information to the world. And he received this information from one of the, some people call them bodhisattvas or masters or ascended beings, perfected beings in some way. And he did this work for 40 years. And he took over and updated work that was started by Madame Blavatsky, Alice Bailey. And so he brought it up to date for our times. Now, Jeremy is the author of two amazing books. The first one was The Patterning Instinct, and the most recent one is The Web of Meaning. And that integrated science and traditional wisdom and really to help us find our place and meaning in life and in our place actually in the universe. So Jeremy, it might seem to viewers that our work, our backgrounds, because I speak from the context of the ageless wisdom teachings, and you bring together science and the wisdom tradition, it might seem to our viewers that our work is very different or our ideas are very different. But I think there are a lot of, I think we have a lot in common, perhaps more in common than it might at first appear. And I'd like to ask you, as we start, yes, to talk about why interconnectedness, because thinking about the title of your book, The Web of Meaning, right. Interconnectedness of all. Why is interconnectedness so important to you?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great place to begin. And really, it's something that I sort of came across as I pursued my own search for meaning, which I did over a number of years, because I really spent the first half of my life really believing in the sort of paradigm, the mainstream worldview that I now critique quite extensively and offer something alternative. And it was really in my own, trying to like uncover what was going on in the world and how to really live a truly meaningful life, that I began to see that actually modern science, in whether it's evolutionary biology, system science, complexity science, all kinds of sciences, actually were refuting what I had believed science was telling us, this kind of mainstream worldview of everything is separate, reductionism is the only reality, everything's ultimately meaningless. And at the same time, I was doing research into great wisdom traditions from the past, such as Buddhism and Taoism and indigenous knowledge from around the world. And I noticed they were all pointing to the same underlying reality to start out from, which is that everything is deeply interconnected. Each different tradition might have a different word for that or a different way of explaining that, but that was the fundamental behind it. And what I saw over time was that it was the interconnectedness itself that actually allowed, in my perception, meaning itself to arise. That I began to, in fact, I describe in the book, I see meaning itself as kind of a function of connectedness.
The idea of meaning is quite extraordinary because we live and we are told that there is no meaning to life, and the prevailing worldview tells us that there's little purpose and no meaning to it, and that this is all some sort of strange mistake or happenstance. And yet modern science, systems science, all of these things that you've been looking into with such thoroughness and presenting them so accessibly, tells us quite the opposite. And so this is a very strange point that we've reached in our civilization, where we're told that reality has certain characteristics, and yet these do not chime, they do not resonate with many people these days. If we look at the predominant ideas, it is that we are separate, as you've just said, and there is very little that we should do to get rid of things like competition, for example, because that's part of the nature of this reality we're told about.
Yes, exactly. No, I think that's completely true. And to your point, about, I feel like we're presented with a false choice in the modern way of thinking. If you read, and some people who are the primary spokespersons for reductionism, but they say they're spokespersons for science. And that's the thing. Like there's somebody called Steven Weinberg, who passed away just fairly recently, but he was a very well-known, he was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he would talk about, he's the one who said something like, the more we understand about the universe, the more pointless it seems to be. Exactly. And then people like that, and similarly, anyone like Richard Dawkins, or so many of these reductionists, who really are the sort of mainstream voice in today's world, I believe, often say, look, you're presented with this choice. Either you want to believe in some mystical, made up fiction in order to feel better about the world, sure, go ahead. But that's your choice. But if you want to be really real about the world and see it the way it is, you just have to accept this terrible existential despair of realizing there's no meaning anywhere. And so we have to make our own meaning just from being alive. So, and that's what I discovered. And I was very seriously, like when I was doing my own search for meaning, I made a vow to myself. I wanted it to be something that my reason, my cognitive processes could totally believe in. I wasn't going to just take something on an act of faith. And that's where I said, look, if I have to believe that, okay, so be it. But that's when I realized this is every bit as much of a myth, a fiction, as the fictions that they are claiming, maybe that God created the world in 6 days or whatever, all these things. And it's what I call in the book ontological reductionism. And basically, the way to understand it is simply this. The reductionism itself is a very powerful system that God developed around the 17th century as a way to understand how nature works. And you sort of, the basic process is, it's methodology. You sort of cut things up into tiny little pieces, study the little pieces, cut them up even further, and you can understand great things. We understand things like atomic, how particles are like the molecular structures of things, or basic things about hygiene we discover through reductionism. It's wonderful. It's an incredibly powerful methodology, and we can all be grateful for it. But then there's this ontological leap of faith that so many scientists have taken since that time in the 17th century, which is to say, this is so powerful that it must explain everything about the universe. And it's so powerful that any other explanation that doesn't, on this basis, must be wrong. That is a leap of faith that has no basis in empirical reason, in fact. And what modern system sciences show, they don't reject reductionism as a powerful way to understand things, but they say, in addition to that, complex systems, as they connect up together, form more emergence. And so you have different levels of complexity. And at those new levels of complexity, new rules and principles apply, not instead of those reductionist principles, but as well as. Yeah. And that's what is so, it seems so obvious. How could anybody not even take that? But that's what reductionists argue against. But what I found so fascinating is that that's a bridge to recognize that our deepest intuition about connectedness, about meaning, about oneness, like of all things, actually are not in place of scientific rational thought, but actually are the very things that real good system science points towards. So when we have those intuitions, they are validating in our bodies, in our felt existence, what we're actually told by real system science.
Yes, and this dovetails so well into as I'm listening to you, I'm saying yes, because it checks for me a number of things. One of the things you said was, and it was almost like hearing myself when I first met the work of Benjamin Graham, which was some 40 years ago or more. I said to myself, it has to, what I'm hearing and what I'm investigating now, because I looked into politics and I looked into philosophy and religion and so on, they didn't answer the questions. And they weren't synthetic enough. They didn't bring a whole picture. When I discovered the work of Benjamin Graham, I said, it has to meet my highest, most critical standards, as you've just put it, my cognitive probing. It has to meet those standards. At the same time, what you've also just said, it confirmed for me something that was, and I think for everyone and for many people now, I think this is where we are in the world at the moment. For many people, there's a sense of a turning and a changing because people are beginning empirically to discover and to experience just what you've said, that there is this deepest, dearest, most precious part of ourselves must come in to the picture and form the whole for us. Otherwise, I feel that we're looking at life through, I think you also use the phrase, one lens. We're just looking at the world from only one point of view, and these must come together. And we know that the ancient scriptures, Vedic scriptures, etc., and modern science confirm and endorse each other. Do they not? And I think that what you're just talking about now is fascinating, because you're beginning to explore, and in your latest book, The Web of Meaning, you've explored those big questions which come to all of us. You've never been afraid of big questions, I know. And you, in your book, you really go head on with the great verities, the ancient verities. So you talk about who am I? Where am I? Why am I? Perhaps you'd like to say something about that, Jeremy, as it's informed the book and your thinking.
Yeah, sure, exactly. And as you say, I structured this book according to those big questions. Because what I saw is that every one of those fundamental sort of existential questions that really probably every human being asks at some point in their life, if not exactly in those words, in some form like that, every one of those has been answered wrongly by our dominant modern worldview. And what we see is this worldview that people take for granted around the world now is driving our whole civilization to catastrophe. We're destroying the earth, the living earth at too rapid a pace. The inequalities are tearing things apart. We're headed towards the cliff. But what I saw is that this modern worldview is not just dangerous, but it's plain wrong. And so in each of these questions, what I kind of do in the book is look at what the modern worldview tells us, and then show how both science and traditional wisdom show us why that is actually not just kind of misguided or dangerous, but wrong. So who am I? We're told, well, it kind of starts with that Descartes thing, I think, therefore I am. And if you sort of peel that's what that means, basically you're saying that my only identity as a human being is this conceptual consciousness, this thinking capability. And, traditional Christianity viewed that as being what connected us with the divine, and that was our divinity. And so therefore, our own bodies are just kind of mere housing for this kind of soul or this mind, that thinking capacity. And other animals don't think like humans, so they don't even have an existence. They're just mere machines or whatever.
Which explains that our attitude towards the natural world and our extractivist tendencies, how we can quite happily go on exploiting the whole of the natural world, and as you say, end up at the edge of the precipice.
Exactly right. And so then again, if you sort of look at what modern science tells us, it says actually, as human beings, that we do have this uniquely advanced thinking capability, that our prefrontal cortex allows us to think symbolically and develop all the tools of civilization. That's great. That's not something to reject or feel bad about. But at the same time, we have this deep animate consciousness. We are living sentient beings. And in fact, we find that all other beings around us, not just high functioning mammals like, say, elephants or whales or dolphins, who are clearly intelligent and have their own language and everything, but even trees and plants are deeply intelligent. They have multiple ways of sensing the environment. They communicate with each other. Even microscopic cells are unbelievably intelligent, we've discovered. And actually a single cell, of which we have like 40 trillion in our bodies, a single cell has more intelligence than the most advanced AI right now in its ability to put things together, to make decisions, to know what to do. This is the intelligence of the earth around us. So our identity is actually this, not just the conceptual, but the animate consciousness or intelligence. And that allows us to see, in our lives, we can actually integrate it all together, which is really this foundation for how we explore the universe. This we were talking about earlier. We need to find answers or ways of exploring that don't just speak to our minds or don't just speak to our intuition, but allow that integrated sense of, aha, this like sounds right for all the different parts of me.
Yeah. And I think it's so fascinating too to think about that we've discovered through systems biology and so on, that in fact, in some cases, and this is very interesting to do with connectivity, interconnectedness, is that consciousness is capable of existing outside of a physical structure. We know this now about plants. There seems to be a way in which some sort of animate consciousness, and I think both of us are talking about consciousness, sentiency, an animate sense of and awareness of ourselves, and as you put it in your book, our part, our place in the universe. Mm-hmm. From the esoteric point of view, there is only interconnectedness. If I can say that, space is a being, life is a being, we are part of that being, and as such we have to learn to come into a different relationship with each other and to learn to relate in different ways, which is why it's so urgent. So I'm bringing the philosophical, if you like, the esoteric into everyday life right now. And this is why it's so important and so urgent that we come into a different relationship with each other, with ourselves, and with the natural world, with all living beings.
Yeah, I think that is beautifully said. And I totally agree with where you're going on bringing those profound intuitions, that sense of what's truly spiritual and sacred, bringing it into our daily activity. It reminds me of this beautiful Zen quote from a Zen master. It goes something like this, like, he who treasures the sacred and despises the ordinary is still bobbing in the ocean of delusion, or something like that, which I think is so beautiful, because that's what it is. There's actually sacredness in every moment of our existence, in the most mundane conversation, the most mundane thoughts that we have that just goes through our minds or whatever. And it's that ability to recognize that each moment of our existence is this sacred treasure, and to feel gratitude for the just the way in which the source somehow enabled each of us to have this consciousness, to be touching into this amazing unfolding of the universe. To me, that is a way to really allow our lives to be really lived in truly with reverence for the universe that we find ourselves part of.
Yeah, precisely. And I suppose you've answered the question then of who am I and why am I? And perhaps I'd like to, because I know that you have another book that you're planning and perhaps you already started working on. And I know that one of the questions that we all ask, and certainly in Share International, we ask this all the time, is what sort of world do we want? I know that you've asked the question, where are we going? How are we going to get there? What do we need to do? What do we need to change in ourselves in order in our everyday lives? And I thank you for this wonderful idea of every moment being sacred. That is precisely, and that we should approach everything and every moment with that reverence, because it is really to do with the development and refinement of consciousness and coming into different rapport with everything. So perhaps you'd like to say something about, because we can't not say something about COP26, and we can't avoid looking at what's happening in our planet at the moment. And people talk about climate crisis, and I'd like to talk about climate justice as well, which is to do with the suffering of millions of people.
Yes.
Precisely because we are allowing our planet to go on being degraded and destroyed. And we need to look at those as well if we're talking about where do we want to go? What kind of world do we want? What kind of civilization do we need?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing these really big, important topics into the conversation, Felicity. And that's, I think, just at a meta level for a moment, I just kind of wanted to point to say again how important it is to recognize that, exactly as you're leading to, that the spiritual and the politically engaged all work together in an integrated whole. And as part of the mistakes of our modern worldview, to see them as being separate. And that's what I try to, what I do in the book, that I kind of look at some of these profound implications of our connectedness. And at the same time, it's a very, I look squarely at some of the most desperately terrible elements of our reality right now, the ways in which we're destroying the living earth, the way in which we've really now started out on the sixth extinction of species since life began on this earth, this one being human caused. I mean, believe it or not, 68% of animal populations around the world have disappeared since 1970. We're basically wiping out the richness and abundance of life. And that's why when we look at something like COP26, I mean, first off, we need to recognize how this climate emergency is unfolding. So, and our governments and our whole global capitalist system, rather than doing anything to prevent it, is actually just leading it on. And to use Greta Thunberg's simple way of saying it, just going blah, 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 while we're actually headed towards the precipice. Yeah. But then we need to recognize that even climate itself is just this symptom of a deeper underlying malaise of the way in which we're destroying the living earth. It's just a sort of the first level. And we could look at anything like global water shortages or the loss of life's richness and everything else around that. And we have to see that it's our modern worldview that sees nature just as this resource to exploit, and that sees humans as separate individuals, and sees competition, to what you were saying earlier, as the fundamental ideology that is meant to lead to human material success or whatever. These are the things that have to be recognized and altered to allow a different kind of civilization to occur. And that's where you were mentioning this next book that I've just started working on. and which is a little bit essentially like a follow-on from the web of meaning. Because if the web of meaning takes us to realizing that there is this different way of making sense of the world that could be a solid platform for the future path of humanity, one that doesn't reject science, but accepts it, but properly accepts it as a foundation, along with, integrated with traditional wisdom to move forward. Once we get that clear, then the question becomes exactly to say, what kind of civilization would it look like that was based on deep interconnectedness? And that's where I've gotten very excited by a vision that others have developed, and I've kind of embraced myself. It's called this notion of an ecological civilization. And it's this recognition that we need to fundamentally change the basis of our civilization. It's not just a matter of changing the economics or taxing the billionaires or investing in renewables, all these things, good things to do, needed to do. But we have to go to the almost like the operating system, the very basis. And what we need to do is move from a civilization that is extractive and exploitative and values wealth and status above all else to simply a civilization that is life affirming, a civilization that is based fundamentally on setting the conditions for flourishing for humans on a regenerated earth. It's as simple as that. And when you start from that basis, you begin to come up with different ways of making sense just about everything, whether it's economics, education, the use for technology, how cities are designed, everything around that looks different.
Yeah. Talking about interconnectedness, and that would actually be, that sense of interconnectedness would actually be the foundation for the sort of civilization we want to create with all of us. Brings me back to a question that I know confuses some people. We talk about oneness. Now, Share International talks a lot about oneness, the fact that humanity is one. And I can put it in our terms, and then I'll translate it into your terms. So it's this idea of interconnectedness, and it's more than that. It's this actually, from the esoteric point of view, that we're all one great being, a great part of a great oversoul. And if that is the case, and we are all this oneness, it does not mean that we are wiping out the idea of diversity. In fact, one of Benjamin Krem's books is called Unity in Diversity, and it calls on us to celebrate the uniqueness of every single one of us and the uniqueness of all different aspects of the natural world. So that has to be understood, I think. Otherwise, people think, oh, we're going to go into this sort of, you know, monotonous gray world where we're all the same. Not at all. It's the celebration of the uniqueness of each individual, finding his place, finding meaning, as you point out, in this world that we want to create so that all can flourish. And that means that we have to accept that, supposing we accept as a hypothesis that we're one being, somehow interconnected, whether we talk about it scientifically or philosophically or esoterically, however, if that is the case, then all of our systems, our structures have to be based on that truth, that reality. So our economics, our politics, etc. But why Benjamin Krem was talking about the coming of the masters and the coming of a new way of thinking was that one of the things that is put forward is the need to accept the idea, if there's oneness, then there has to be absolute clarity of that oneness throughout all the systems. And one of the easiest ways to achieve that is to say, and it sounds simple, take your brother's need as the measure for your action and act accordingly. And therefore, the idea in politics and in economics is the idea of sharing, share the world's resources equitably. So, and this as a structural change, if that happens, you at a stroke can solve a lot of the world's problems. I don't know how you see this. Perhaps it sounds too utopian, but we always ask people to consider these as hypotheses anyway. Consider it as a hypothesis and think. But I wonder how you think about that. So it's not simply sharing your garden tools or your car or whatever, but actually changing the system, changing the hearts and minds of humanity. And I think this is what you were saying when you said it needs to be a fundamental change.
Exactly. God, it's so beautifully stated. And I'm actually really struck that one of those early books by Benjamin Crumb was called Unity in Diversity or Through Diversity.
Yes,
because
absolutely. Yeah.
One of the foundations that as I've tried to distill what an ecological civilization really has as its foundational cause, it's coming up with exactly the same phrase of actually unity through diversity. Yeah. Because I think that captures, it's both a paradox and it's this beautiful, just with a few words, explanation of what is this fundamental reality of life. And what I love to do is look at life itself as a teacher for exactly what we're talking about. So if you just think of any organism, ourselves as an organism, here we are with our 40 trillion cells doing their thing. And each cell, you have all these different types of cells for different organs and blood cells and neurons and all very, very different, doing their own thing. And yet they're all part of this coherent whole. There's this concept in systems biology that's well described by these biology philosopher Evan Thompson, called reciprocal causality, where basically all the different parts of a system are what creates the whole. And meanwhile, the whole itself is affecting all of the different parts. It's sort of setting the sort of coherence for all the different parts. That's why it's reciprocal. And in an organism, obviously something like the DNA is the way in which each cell recognizes that it's part of something bigger. So each cell's doing its thing, but it knows that it's part of the same organism that everything else is part of. And ecosystems, similarly, you've got the grass, and you've got the trees and the elephants and the beetles and the fungal network, all very different, but all working symbiotically. Not like I don't think they necessarily, have some brain going, oh, I should be doing this as part of the bigger whole. But the brain is that deep, distributed intelligence of nature itself, which really extends through an ecosystem. So biologists have now begun to see that ecosystems themselves learn. They actually have their own intelligence once we recognize that intelligence can be something that is distributed. And so they are all part of creating this whole and this flourishing. And we know that ecosystems through this can be incredibly resilient and diverse and evolve and stay coherently whole through millions of years, no matter what happens to them, until humans come along to just destroy them, basically. But if we can learn from nature and we build our own a civilization on that basis, that's what's so beautiful, because it allows that diversity. It encourages different groups, self-identified, whether by gender or by a belief system or by any kind of elements or ethnic identity, whatever, to be fully themselves. It doesn't say, oh, you need to fit in with some bigger system or one is better than the other, in just a way that an elephant is not better than the fungal network or the beetle or the dung beetle. They all have their parts to play, each one crucially important as part of that system. And they're all doing it not in this way that we're told in modern neoliberal ideology, as a zero-sum game, that I need to find my own individuality at the expense of everything else. But it's actually, we recognize that our fullness of our identity actually gets to be most expressed, most manifest, when our identity expands to be not just our individuality, but also our group, also all of our nation state, whatever it might be, all of humanity, all of life. And when we can sort of moment by moment feel those different layers of identity as all flowing together as part of who we are as an organism, that allows us to truly fulfill, I think, our purpose in life.
Yeah. Fantastic. There are a couple of things you said there that I'd like to pick up on. One is the, let's say, the elephant in the room, as it were, and that is capitalism. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on is what you've just said, which is that growing sense, I believe it's a growing sense of seeking oneself and uniqueness within the whole, within the group.
Right.
And that is to do, again, Share International would say, this is to do with new energies coming into the world. And the characteristic of the new civilization could be, based on these energies that are coming in, the idea of synthesis, of working together as groups. And we can begin to see that as you look at the growth of people power and the growing strength of the voice of the people moving things forward. But I'd like to come to the elephant in the room as well, because we can't talk about climate and the state of our civilization and the lack of flourishing of millions of us, if we're talking about well-being and being in right relationship with each other, then we have to talk about where we are at now economically and what's happening to capitalism and how do we see that going forward.
That's right. I'm so glad you brought that in too, because actually I just wrote an article a week or two ago, just prior my own voice for sort of preparation for COP26, with the title of the article is "Solving the Climate Crisis Requires the End of Capitalism." And the reason for that is capitalism is fundamentally, is really, we can see it as the manifestation of this dominant worldview, this worldview that tells us that we're separate from other people, from the rest of the world. And it tells us basically that what we're meant to do is extract as much value as we can from others because they're separate from us. So this worldview is fundamentally extractive and exploitative. And it's no surprise that in that same period around the 17th century in Europe, that the dominant modern worldview really came into being, is also the time when the limited liability corporation came into being, when colonialism came into being, when white supremacy and racism in this modern form came into being. All of these things were part of the same, almost like different sort of sprouting elements of this underlying extractive way of looking at the world, where other people, all of the living earth is a resource to exploit. And that's why capitalism itself has to be shifted, because even if somebody came up with the most fantastic technological solution for renewable energy to energize everything on the earth, and even if somebody came up with fusion, nuclear fusion as some great source, so we never had to deal with fossil fuels again, all this stuff, it would just mean the way capitalism works, it would exploit that, and it would inevitably, this is not just some sort of bug in the system, it's a fundamental to it. It would inevitably then try to exploit it to the max and then just increase the consumption of the living earth even more extensively. So we have to shift the worldview to one of mutually beneficial symbiosis, one that says that actually we have to develop economic systems, cultural systems, political systems, where we actually are driven naturally to, in fact, be part of who we are as humans, because our natural identity as humans is not to be selfish and competitive, but is to actually identify with our group, identify with something bigger. So the opportunity is to develop a system which actually feels right to us, rather than all of us being forced to be in a system which feels wrong to virtually all of us.
And I think more and more people are beginning to have that experience of this feels right, and choosing a different way and choosing different criteria to live by. While you're talking about capitalism and so on, the hold that consumerism has on us has meant that we've in fact consumed our world.
Yes.
the idea of commercialization is based on this idea of competition and greed and selfishness, these old ideas that you're talking about, and we need to get rid of them, which is why the esoteric view put forward by Benjamin Creme is that, again, you need to recognize that we're all part of this whole, and that has to find practical. Everything has to be implemented. These cannot go on being lovely ideas and ideals. These are utopian ideals. We have to make them real. So it has to become fully implemented in our everyday structures to allow the flourishing of all.
Yes.
And what we have at the moment, and I don't know if you would agree, but it is a sort of economic fascism. We have big pharma, we have big tech, we have big, these huge multinationals, corporations that are richer than countries, and so on and so on.
That's right.
Yes, please go on.
Oh yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. In fact, if you look, there are these kind of a few mind-blowing statistics. Like if you look at the 100 largest economies in the world, it turns out that 69 of them are in fact these transnational corporations, not countries at all. And the transnational corporations really have come to dominate virtually every aspect of human life. And the governments themselves in most countries are just basically these revolving doors between the executive levels of these massive corporations and the executive levels of government. The government really has begun to be more than anything just an agent to allow these transnational corporations to even more enforce their stranglehold over humanity. Yes. And the thing that is so terrifying about it is we recognize these corporations are designed with just one objective in mind, which is to maximize shareholder returns. And so much so that even if you have a really good ethical person who rises to the ranks and becomes the CEO of one of these corporations, if he starts to do things that actually are ethical, the company can get sued for not making the decisions to maximize shareholder returns. If there's some copper mine which is causing massive pollution and employing people at starvation wages, and he says, no, we're going to actually shut down that mine because we can do something in a different way that's not so polluting. But then the competitors then buy the mine and make more money from that, he'll get sued for not optimizing for his corporation. Mm-hmm. So in human terms, these corporations would be considered, if they were really persons, rather than just these legal persons that they're given the power to be, they are psychopaths. Because it's a psychopath who actually goes around without any actual true empathy or compassion and says, I'm going to do everything, manipulate the world to optimize for myself, no matter what happens. If I've got to kill somebody, I'll just make sure I don't get caught, but I'll just do it without thinking. And the thing about psychopaths, they can look very charming. Because they spend a lot of their time just looking at how they can optimize for how people will react to them. Corporations are the same. So they go around saying, we're going to do well by doing good. And you'll see no end of advertising about even, the absolute farcical irony of ExxonMobil, a company that spent hundreds of millions of dollars obfuscating and lying over 3 or 4 decades, knowing that climate was going to cause this disaster and stopping the conversation about it. And now they have these advertising things like, we found ways, responsible use of fossil fuels to allow for a sustainable future. This lie after lie. And we see that across the board. And we have to grab the nettle by the hand. We have to basically say, no, we have to recognize the power of these global corporations, and we have to change their DNA so that they are no longer allowed to just optimize for shareholder value without caring about humans and the planet.
Yeah, I can imagine that viewers might be feeling a little bit depressed after some of the things we've said. So I'd like to say that, of course, we're talking about this because it is at this time, which is such a pivotal moment, that we can make these changes. And it is important for us to realize that we can take action, we can make the changes. That has to start with everyone at every level, and we have to let our voices and our thoughts be heard. We have to make sure that it eventually leaks through to the powers that be. I know that, and you know that, we're not going to get rid of the oligarchs overnight, but it may or may not be something that makes people happy, our viewers happy. But I can tell you that Benjamin Creme and the master that he works with have actually indicated that a financial collapse, an economic collapse, which now many experts say is simply a matter of when rather than if, will bring eventually bring humanity to its senses. It will bring down those huge structures we've just been talking about, because, as you say, they have power across the board. They've bought the politicians, they've changed the laws, they've deregulated. There's, there's the media is certainly
completely controlled.
Under control, and so on and so on. And people are perhaps not always aware of how many tentacles there are right across our society, our civilization, society as it is. But it might not be good news in the short run, but if we consider that we can actually no longer continue as we are. We have come to the end of the road of capitalism, of the exploitation and extractivist policies that we have. We cannot go on letting millions of people be ill or die and not have the wherewithal. Share International has the name Share because we espouse the idea that it is to do with the sharing of the world's resources, the know-how, etc. Every human being needs time, needs time to grow, and needs the things that are basic to human life, universal human rights, enough food, shelter, education, healthcare, none of which we can guarantee in any country at the moment. So it may be not good news in the short run, but one of the possibilities is that the economic system will, particularly perhaps under the pressure of the last 2 years, begin to collapse. And it seems to be pretty shaky at the moment. I see, yes, I see you nodding.
Yeah, no, I love everything about what you're saying, Felicity. And I do feel like you, I feel that true hope has to begin with a true realization of the reality that we're in. That's the source of true hope. Because to me, what gets me depressed is when I hear people talk about there's this possibility of the sort of techno-optimists. If we invest, if we change the way the markets are structured, and if we can invest in renewables, and we can do geoengineering to bring the climate back into, then we're okay. Well, we've got a path forward. That's what gets me depressed, because those are basically ways to continue the destruction and not recognize what is actually going on. But when we start from the basis of recognizing what is actually happening, how these billionaire oligarchs are basically destroying our earth, how the system is destroying our earth, then we get the opportunity to say, okay, let's look at changing the system. And where I get a sense of hope and inspiration is this recognition that the change that needs to be done to the system is what virtually every human being actually wants. It's a change that allows us to connect with ourselves, to connect with others, allows us not to be in this desperate competition with others all the time, that allows us to be free to pursue our fullness as human beings, that allows us to love nature and to regenerate nature. And so that's what we have, that the billionaires and the corporations don't have. They have to condition every human being from childhood to get rid of their own true intuition and get to be part of this system of destruction. The hope arises from allowing people to wake up to the truth that actually is in their hearts already.
Wonderful. Jeremy, I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking I'd like to ask you just to describe briefly. I believe that you're going to do a series of lessons online. There is a link being given, and it is www.earthliteracies.org. Jeremy Lent, The Web of Meaning, a guided exploration. And perhaps you'd like to say just a little bit before we go over into questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, Felicity. Well, basically, so this book, The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, it launched just this summer. And as a result of the interest in the book, I've now going to be launching a series of 6 2-hour-long classes that'll begin on Tuesday, the 2nd of November. So just coming up in a week and a half. And they're going to be taking place at 10 a.m. Pacific time, which I deliberately did so that people in England and Europe could easily access it in the evening too. And there's going to be 6 classes, each one looking at those fundamental questions that we've been talking about. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? Why am I? And where are we going? And each one will be, I'll be giving presentations about the topics from the book, as well as we'll have breakout groups to discuss these questions together and general discussions together with some reading and assignments. So it'll be a way to really, I'm calling it a guided exploration of the web of meaning. And so it's this great opportunity for not just to sort of go deeper into these questions, but with other like-minded people from around the world to share the exploration that's available to us all.
It sounds brilliant, because that's exactly what we need. We need people who are forward-thinking and people who are actually brave enough and unique enough, aware of their own uniqueness enough so they can listen to that voice, which is them, and bring those ideas together with other like-minded people. I think I need to stop there. I just wanted to say, for people who are interested in Share International, you can find Share International, and at the end of the program we'll be putting up some links so you can see their information about Share International, the magazine, which tries to explore ideas just like this. There it is there, some covers of the magazine. And I would also like to mention that Benjamin Creme wrote many books, and there are 4 which are free downloadable books, and there they are there. Unity and Diversity is not one of them, but that's also available, of course. So that's just a few of the books which are freely available. And I think now we'd like to ask Megan to join us again, and put the questions to both of us, questions that have come in. I see there are quite a few. So Megan, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the questions that have been sent in. The first one is actually directed to both of you, but perhaps Jeremy would like to answer it first. What individual actions accelerate this shift from capitalism to a sharing and cooperative way of organizing civilization?
Great question. Yeah, thank you for asking that. And yeah, I think that it's more than anything is not a specific action, but where the action's coming from in our heart is this place of actually recognizing that we are part of this web of meaning. We're part of this deep interconnectedness with others and all the different dimensions of our lives, and that our individual lives, our community lives, and our place in the political systems are also deeply interconnected. So I think that the actions all need to come from that place of recognizing our connectedness and wanting to be part of this movement towards transformation. So one way that I like to think of it more than anything is to see what our actions are, our need for transformation to be happening at those 3 different layers of within the self, with community and in the political system. So some people say, it's all about getting involved in activism and get out there and, fight for the good things. Other people might go the other extreme and say, I really need to first begin with myself. And, it all becomes from my sense of love and unconditional love that then has to extend. All of those things are partially true, but in my mind, it's recognizing how each of those three layers relate fractally to each other, and the transformation has to always be taking place within all parts. That to be out there on the streets, but to do it with a sense of hate and anger in your mind for those bad people who are causing the destruction only leads to further separation. And to spend the time like working on one's own spiritual fulfillment, but to say, but to leave aside the terrible destruction that's happening outside your own world, and having the privilege to do that and not recognizing where that privilege comes from is also moves away from that. So it's like recognizing how everything connects is a fundamental to that that activism that's required in my mind.
Felicity, did you want to add to that?
Well, I totally agree with Jeremy, of course. I'd also like to say that what we ended by saying, which was, join with others, join with like-minded people, make sure that synergy is a great power, bringing people together, and synergy will bring things forward in a way that individual action won't. And the other thing one can really think about doing is, in practical terms, take action locally. Of course, we know the usual saying, think globally, etc., but also think of acting locally. And for example, there are very interesting things happening in South America along those lines. People are starting to work, and it has now spread to places like India and a number of other countries, where you have, for example, local people, just ordinary citizens, taking part in deciding how the local budget will be spent. So you have direct access to changing things. So I think that's very important. I thought I'd just mention that. There are many other ways. I'm sure there are loads of questions, so.
Right, yes. Speaking of which, the next one, I think this is directed at Jeremy. The person is asking, how do you prevent resistance to this different worldview, especially from the older generation who have been sold and brought up in the system that is basically killing us and killing nature?
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that it's also good to recognize that the resistance doesn't just come from those people out there, but I think most of us, virtually all of us, and I believe it's true for me too, we have those places of resistance within our own minds, within our own consciousness. Anyone who's been brought up in the Western worldview in one way or another, we get to internalize some of these blockages within ourselves. And so I think this process of decolonizing our own minds is just as important as changing minds out there. And in my view, the key, the absolute magic key to working with resistance, whether it's within ourselves or those people who seem to be our opponents out there, is actually kindness. Is actually not trying to fight it with force and break down the resistance, because then the resistance generally just gets even harder. And even if it breaks down temporarily, it just rebuilds even stronger, just like scar tissue is like tougher than the skin itself. So I think through kindness, if we recognize that kindness is basically the etymology of it, is this actually acting according to kin, treating each person, part of ourselves and others, recognizing we're all part of ultimately the same family, that same oneness we've been talking about. And coming from there allows us to really open the minds of those who are seeming to be resistant, and helping them to share, not to see that they're bad people, they're doing things that are wrong, but to arise and to want to change their own actions because of awakening the desire within them to start acting for life, to actually start acting for future generations, to actually do things in a different way because it's coming from their hearts. That's the way in which I think the true transformation can really take place.
I think that actually ties in with this next question, the need for kindness and how you broach these new ideas. This is a physical education and health teacher who works with youth and wants to know how to introduce the principles of self-awareness and interconnectedness into the school system instead of the education for a job sort of attitude.
Yeah, I think that is fundamental because, you know, ultimately the changes that we need will come from new generations looking at things in different ways. And just like we were talking about the corporate domination of our economy and media and everything else, we need to recognize that the conventional school system, the way it is right now, is not designed to actually help young people to grow, to fulfill who they truly are as human beings. But it's actually designed to shape them, to actually remodel them to become consumers, to be cogs in this corporate dominated machine, to become good consumers, and then to their idea of success is to be productive, whatever engineers, technocrats, or business people, to actually feel that they're doing good while they're actually part of this destructive process that is taking the soul out of the living earth. So I think that we have to fundamentally change education. Yeah, I think the ideas we see in things like Montessori schools around the world, or different approaches to education, or what is needed, where the foundation is to actually allow each child to truly fulfill, in Aristotle's great term, eudaimonia, to pursue this source of full well-being for themselves, to fulfill their true potential as a human being. And when they do that, they'll naturally want to be part of community, want to be part of doing something productive for the earth, rather than to gain status at the expense of something else. It's just as fundamental a shift as everything else in our civilization, but it has to begin with this recognition that our education is doing the wrong thing right from the outset.
It very much is the case, as Jeremy says, that we do educate at the moment simply for people to fit into the consumerist model and take their place as a little cog. We have to ask ourselves what, and we come back to the idea of meaning, of consciousness, of evolution, of sentience, and so on. And we have to ask, what is a human being and what is education for? And if education is to allow someone to be their fullest self in the most productive way for themselves and for their community and so on, then education will automatically change. Because if we recognize that everyone is a soul in incarnation, and each person comes in, according to esotericism, with 3 fundamental purposes for each life. Now, one of those is, for all of us, we all have this in common, is to be in right relationship with each other and with our environment. That is not possible at the moment, given our educational norms and standards. But if each life has these purposes, which are unique to each one, then it means we have to allow for that and actually build that into the educational system, so that there is a place for a child to be itself and to develop and discover that self, and to know itself as far more than simply the little boy or girl who's sitting in the class and having to follow certain ways of thinking. Because, and more people are aware of the fact that they are more than just, and this is why we have the malaise, the sense of malaise and meaninglessness, which we know, because people are sensing they are more and they need more, and then more has to chime with what they are.
Yeah, and if I can just add some specifics to the more sort of philosophical way we've answered that question, there are so many different opportunities, like in academic curricula, things like actually having ecological studies as a foundational core course, focusing on interdisciplinary studies rather than getting people to be just focused on expertise in different areas. In phys ed, shifting away from competition, from competitive sports games, to actually looking at ways in which people can compete with themselves to be as part of a harmonious whole, moving towards things like some East Asian type of practices, like Qigong type practices, or sort of judo or other quote unquote martial arts, but arts which actually look at ways like Aikido, ways of relating to others in a whole integrated system, not in this purely competitive way.
Actually, that leads on rather nicely to this next question. A question for you, Jeremy. Could you please share your thoughts on the Eastern sciences of yoga and meditation, if you have any?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, personally, I discovered meditation around the time that I was doing my first exploration, that cognitive exploration I described earlier, of trying to find out where meaning came from. And to me, the embodied exploration was just as important. And for me, meditation is fundamental. When I first discovered it, I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was sort of coming home in a way that I sensed was always there, but never realized it was possible for me as a human being to experience. I feel profound gratitude every day of my life to those teachings of meditation, to allow that way of just being with oneself. And in addition to that, for me, yoga is one very profound way of connecting the mind with the body in this more integrated way. And for me, in addition to yoga, those traditional Chinese practices of Qigong and Tai Chi, just personally, I found to be even more powerful as a way of recognizing. I mean, sometimes in meditation or even in yoga, sometimes it's more like you're instructed to, yes, as if you're still the mind, but you're instructed to sort of feel into the body and recognize what is the body feeling and how to connect with the body. And what I found personally most powerful in these other East Asian practices of like Qigong especially, is that you become the body itself. That rather than I'm the mind in the body, it's like I become the body that recognizes it has a mind. And as if the whole locus of identity shifts down into this core of who I am as an embodied being, which I find to be very profound. But all of these practices are all about moving towards a more integrated way of harmonizing within ourselves and with life. Very important, I think. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that meditation is actually one of the core activities of Share International, and a particular type of meditation was introduced by Benjamin Creme, his master, and that is to do with the actually the transmission of energy, and one simply is used in group formation as a channel, but we are not directing the energies. The energies are simply put through our chakras, the higher chakras, which I'm sure people know about, the centers, the force field centers in the body. And these energies are being used by the masters, by the world teacher, to make the changes possible. And these ideas, these energies actually are embodied in certain ideas, the sort of ideas that we've been talking about now. And as Jeremy explained too, when you're in meditation, of course, yoga actually means bringing something into one-ment and alignment, and that is necessary for all human beings. Gradually are gravitating towards and looking for ways of meditating, and each to his own, of course. There's not one prescribed way of meditating, each to his own, but it is a way of bringing the person, the mind, etc., into alignment with his higher or deeper transpersonal self, higher self, however you wish to put it, his or hers.
So the next rather esoteric question is, Jeremy, this lady wonders if you believe in reincarnation, in other words, the continuity of our existence.
Yeah, this is obviously another profound question. And I certainly don't claim to have any greater insights than anyone else might have. So, but I can certainly share my own personal sort of sense of what has arisen from the way in which I describe the worldview as I understand it in the web of meaning, integrating these different traditions. And it comes a lot from this recognition of the importance of this connectedness, and just like we've been describing. And what has really moved me is in Neo-Confucian school of thinking in China during the Song Dynasty, it actually incorporated Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian ideas into a synthetic whole. And they looked at the whole universe as being like qi and li. Qi is like the sort of matter or energy of the universe. And the li is sort of a little bit, Felicity, like you've been describing the way Benjamin Creme has described it. It's like this, almost the field in which the qi interacts. The stuff cannot exist without those interactions, like ripples in the sort of energy fields. And that's what actually allows all of our matter to arise in different forms, whether it's a human being, a stone, the wind, the whole universe, whatever it is. And once we recognize that our identity itself is not this fixed stuff, that my very body is always transforming and changing, that if I think of myself when I was a little child, there's not a single molecule in that little boy who's in me now, but the coherent principles of organization are what stays resilient. And similarly, when we recognize we exist in this ocean of Li, then we recognize that actually is my spirit, what is really me, is being transmitted all the time to others, and other spirits transmitted back to me. So my own sense is that when my body dies, it's really like a little bit like a little particular whirlpool in this river of time and life, just sort of stops being coherent as a particular whirlpool. But my actual spirit, that Li, that's been part of this coherent organism that is me, continues to exist right there in its connectedness with all other beings that I, in that coherent form I was in, was connected with during that time where my body was alive. So in that sense, it feels to me that for each of us, our own death is really just one little moment. It means something to the embodied organism, but it means very little to the spirit that has really been part of us, that is now part of all of the unfolding of life around us.
Yes, as I see it and as I understand it, the soul reincarnates. And when we talk about reincarnation, I have to make it quite clear, because many people think straight away, oh, you mean transmigration of, and you could become an animal, and if you've been bad, you come back as this or that, whatever. Well, that's an interesting reference to a really scientific law, a great law of the universe, which is the law of cause and effect, of course, which in the East is known as karma. And people have got so used to the idea of saying, oh, it must be your karma, this and that. But to go back to the issue, the soul reincarnates again and again, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman. We tend to, as I understand it, and this is based on my reading and what I understand from Benjamin Creme, is that we tend to reincarnate in groups, working out that karma, that the give and take, the relationships, etc., righting some wrongs and developing. And this is how life proceeds. And life, because actually what esotericism is talking about here, the ageless wisdom teaching, is the evolution of consciousness. And the consciousness continues. It is that sentience that continues. I love the way you put it, and talked about the spirit will continue, and the death is, well, it's not particularly important except to that particular body and personality, but the soul continues, and it depends on the destiny or the circumstance of a particular person, will come back into incarnation again, and the process of evolution will continue. So it's not evolution as we know it as Darwinism, but it is the evolution of consciousness. So it's not the evolution of form, but the evolution of consciousness. I see that I'm getting a message to say that we're nearing the end of our session because we've gone over time, but perhaps there's one more burning question that we should answer, and then I think we should round it off after that.
do you think that countries becoming more self-sufficient and sharing their surplus production with other nation states would help break the cycle of gross overconsumptions, which is especially prevalent in the West? Jeremy?
Yes, I think that there's this great concept of known as cosmo-localism, or sometimes glocalism, which is more of a difficult word for, but it's this concept of actually getting more self-sufficient within each of our communities, and also recognizing that we are part of this global system, and that and acting in the way that I call fractal flourishing, like recognizing each of our communities as a fractal part of a bigger pattern, which ultimately is all of humanity and all of life on Earth. And so what that means is I'm a huge supporter in us looking at growing locally, reducing the needs we have from globalization and from things that are coming externally, and not even thinking so much in terms of nation states, but really to think in terms of bioregions. There's a particular area which has its own coherence, is a particular region based on its land-based needs and its weather patterns, et cetera. That's even better way to sort of structure that sort of localism. But there's also this risk that move towards localism, especially for those privileged communities in the global north who are less affected by the disasters that our civilization has wrought on the world, then tends to then erect barriers and then let others kind of drown while they're focusing on just their own self-sufficiency. So it's equally important to that second part of what that question said, as like any surplus, and actually recognizing that we have a need in those sufficient communities, self-sufficient communities, to really be part of this bigger system and not just kind of close down and focus only on local, but focus on our deep interconnectedness and recognize our need to be part of transforming some of those societies which right now don't have the ability to be self-sufficient because they've had their wealth basically stolen from them by colonialism over the last few hundred years. So they're left without the basis for looking after themselves.
One of the pieces of economic advice, which is to do with social justice, is the idea put forward by Maitreya, and the masters Benjamin Creme talks about it in all of his books, is the notion of developing a global system. And I totally agree with Jeremy about making sure that you work locally as much as possible so that we avoid all of this transport and pollution by insisting on transporting fresh strawberries from here to wherever it is and so on, out of season. So if we can get rid of that, at the same time, we should really be looking at, and that's the idea of exchanging surplus. So each country should have what it needs and what it has above and beyond its basic needs. If the needs of its people are met, that should be put into a sort of a pool, and that pool of resources should then be equitably distributed wherever it's needed, actually not just according to need. There's an extraordinary event unfolding at the moment, which is appalling, apart from the many, many appalling situations in the world. And we can see them every day on our television screens. But for example, in southern Madagascar at the moment, the people have been suffering drought for the last 4 years. They have no more crops, no more food. People are eating their shoes. They are boiling up old leather to try to make a meal for their children. And this is an extraordinary thing to do with climate justice, climate crisis. In the north of the island, people are suffering from too much rain, floods, and mudslides. In the south of the country, people have nothing more. Now, this is just one small example. All of us can cite dozens of examples like this. What we have to do is look and act for the benefit of the whole planet. And when I say the whole planet, all of humanity, all of the natural world. And so that means we have to find a system. And I am led to believe that this system is being thought of. There are blueprints that will lead to something like this, or various forms of some system which will ensure that everyone has sufficient. Because as we've said today several times, we are at an absolutely pivotal moment, and we cannot let it go on. This is the moment we have to grab and seize the opportunity to make all of the changes, starting on every level, wherever you can, start and work, because we're all needed. And all of us can make some kind of contribution. Jeremy, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for being such a wonderful guest and for the richness of your thought. And I wish you well for your next book. And I hope we see you again soon on another webinar for Share International. Megan, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And I believe that there will be a screen coming up now to give further details. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.